Hello and welcome to the Untitled Anarchist Seagull channel. I'm your host, an Untitled Anarchist Seagull called Elise. And this time, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. This might be a fairly short stream, but the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, aka the World Court, just put out a new advisory opinion on Palestine, specifically to do with Israel's obligations in relation to facilitating aid, UN institutions, things like that. And I've only seen a quick summary of it so far in the press release. And the short version is Israel is obliged to actually facilitate the activities of the UN in the occupied Palestinian territory. But I thought it would be good to have a look at the actual opinion, because there's this tendency for bullshit to sort of fly hot and heavy around these opinions. All sorts of just deliberate misinterpretations, often from pro-Israel groups, from pro-Israel states like the US or Germany. And so I thought we should actually just look at the opinion itself. And now, of course, the thing with anything to do with the ICJ and the US and Israel is that there is a big old for what it's worth attached to it, because I mean, they reached the right results for the most part on this question when they've been faced with it, but the trouble is that if the US and Israel don't voluntarily comply with what they say, it kind of doesn't matter. And that's the thing to just note. I mean, this is one of the problems fundamentally with international law, and actually really with law in general. When power goes one way and law goes the other way, either the law bends or the law just becomes irrelevant. And what we've been seeing in Gaza for 2 years is the law just being completely fucking irrelevant. But it's still worth actually knowing what they said. So we're going to do that. So we're just going to have a look at that. Let me just get my chat window. Oh, hang on. My chat window actually isn't added in here because I usually only use this to record videos. Right. New window. How is everybody doing on this coldish Wednesday, chat? Okay. So the opinion, which follows on to a previous opinion which found that the occupation by Israel of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip was illegal, and Israel had an obligation to vacate it immediately, and the deadline actually ran out in September, is called Obligations of Israel in Relation to the Presence and Activities of the United Nations, other international organizations, and third states in and in relation to the occupied Palestinian territory, or Obligations d'Israël en ce qui concerne la présence et les activités de l'Organisation des Nations Unies, d'autres organisations internationales et d'États tiers dans le territoire palestinien occupé et en lien avec celui-ci. Okay. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff that is just procedural. Like, one of the arguments that was raised against even issuing this opinion was that it would prejudge the genocide case that is pending, that was brought by South Africa, and because they would have to carry out significant factual inquiries in order to resolve it, and they found that that was not a valid objection, that this is essentially a pure matter of law as I understand it. So first of all, the way these things work is the General Assembly sends a question. And it asks the ICJ to answer it. Okay, so lots of recallings and reaffirmings. What's the actual question? Expressing grave concern, considering, expressing deep concern, noting also, demands that Israel comply with all of its legal obligations under international law, including as set out by the ICJ, calls upon all parties to reply. Okay, expresses appreciation. Okay, here we go. Here's the actual question that was formulated by the General Assembly and sent to the ICJ. What are the obligations of Israel as an occupying power and as a member of the United Nations in relation to the presence and activities of the United Nations, including its agencies and bodies, other international organizations, and third states in and in relation to the occupied Palestinian territory, which we need to remember includes the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. Including to, when we talk about this in an international law context, including to ensure and facilitate the unhindered provision of urgently needed supplies essential to the survival of the Palestinian civilian population, as well as of basic services and humanitarian and development assistance for the benefit of the Palestinian civilian population and in support of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. Okay, so lots of procedural history, which the people who showed up and participated as counsel in the case. Okay. So, first of all, they rejected an argument. Okay, this is paragraph 27, whether rendering the advisory opinion prejudges elements of a pending contentious case. The pending contentious case is South Africa and Israel, the genocide case. Two participants, we can guess who those are, I think, submitted that the question put to the court is premised on allegations that are currently under consideration in the case concerning application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa, and Israel, and that giving the advisory opinion might prejudge elements relevant to the case. They rejected this argument. The court does not find this argument convincing, as there's a clear difference between the respective subject matters of the two proceedings. In the present case, the court's mandate is limited to the identification of Israel's obligations as an occupying power, which they have repeatedly found Israel is, and as a member of the United Nations, in relation to the presence and activities of the United Nations. So, and they say that just because they indicated provisional measures in the genocide case brought by South Africa, that doesn't actually make this, it doesn't cause sufficient overlap to say that this would be prejudging. There's also been, okay, so another objection was that it was already addressed in previous advisory opinions. And they said, okay, so but what we really want to know is when they found the merits, because they rejected the idea that they did not have jurisdiction for various reasons to answer this question, to consider and answer it. Okay. So they refer back to this, for the historical background, to the 2024 advisory opinion where they ruled that the occupation was illegal, that Israel had an immediate obligation to vacate the entire occupied Palestinian territory, the entire territory occupied in 1967, that is. and that states have a duty not to recognize or in any way support that occupation. Okay, so they mentioned the siege. Okay, so there's a whole lot of history here. Following the 1967 armed conflict known as the Six-Day War and the start of the occupation by Israel, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, UNRWA and Israel concluded a provisional agreement concerning assistance to Palestine refugees in the OPT. That they would continue to do the following thing. Okay, Israel agreed to ensure the protection and security of the personnel, installations, and property of UNRWA. Well, they've been breaching the shit out of that. I mean, for a long time, too. Permit the free movement of UNRWA vehicles into, within, and out of Israel and the areas in question. The areas in question being the 67 territories. To permit international staff of the agency to move in, out, and within Israel in the areas in question. They'll be provided with ID, other passes that might be required. Permit the local staff of the agency to move within the areas. Okay, provide radio, telecom, and landing facilities. I mean, they're in breach of all this stuff. But this is, okay, at one point they did agree to all these things. Okay. Under normal conditions, UNRWA operated almost 400 schools, over 65 primary health clinics, and a hospital, had more than 17,000 personnel assigned to work in the OPT. In the West Bank, it ran 96 schools and 43 health facilities. In the Gaza Strip, UNRWA was the primary provider of essential services, educating around 300,000 children in 288 schools and 2 training centers, delivering health care, some 900,000 patients, and offering emergency assistance to around 1.1 million people. According to the UN, UNRWA was indispensable in delivering essential services to Palestinians in the OPT. Now, you may remember that Israel just declared UNRWA a terrorist organization based on nothing. Like, they had claimed at one point that 12 people working for UNRWA in Gaza were in some way involved with the October 7th operation. 12 out of like 30,000 employees, it's worth noting. They never provided any evidence of that. UNRWA responded by just immediately firing these people without cause, just because they were trying to, I mean, really, when you get down to it, they were trying to ensure their ability to operate, and it's worth noting that did not make any difference at all, because Israel did not sincerely give a shit whether these people were involved in anything. They wanted to shut down the lifeline to Palestinians because it's a lifeline to Palestinians. Okay. Okay, so they actually quite inaccurately... Okay, this summary of October 7th is just inaccurate, it's worth noting, because, yes, more than 1,200 people were killed, not by no means all of them by the Palestinian resistance organizations. That has been established at this point. Exactly how many were killed by Israel by activating the Hannibal Directive, as Yoav Gallant himself has publicly admitted to doing, is a matter that would require significant investigation, though indications are that it's probably in the hundreds. And when they say people, that includes military personnel. And that's important, in particular, because their previous advisory opinions did note that the Palestinians, obviously, as an occupied population, have the right to resist by force, and to resist occupation, and that includes killing occupation forces. Okay, so yeah, confirming no evidence was ever found that anyone working for UNRWA was in fact involved in the October 7th operations. Okay, so on 18th of March 2024, Israel denied the Commissioner General of UNRWA entry into the Gaza Strip. On 2nd October, the Foreign Ministry declared the Secretary General of the United Nations persona non grata in Israel, despite the fact, actually, that he has been bending over backwards to avoid calling a genocide, just for really acknowledging that. I mean, he's been pathetic. Guterres has been absolutely pathetic. But it's still not pathetic enough for Israel. So they issued 2 laws in October 2024 banning UNRWA. Okay, procedural history. Okay, so there's always a section in here, in these advisory opinions, where the court interprets what the opinion means. So they're saying, okay, the request was prompted by, quote, plans and measures, including legislation adopted by Israel, to interfere with or obstruct the presence and operations of the United Nations and UN entities and organizations, including the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, as well as concern that any action taken to impede the provision of basic services. Okay, so this is where they're, which is obvious, I think. And the distinction they're drawing here is between, they're saying this only is to determine what obligations Israel has. They didn't ask for the legal consequences, which is a difference. A lot of the time they're asking for, in these advisory opinions, they're dealing with legal consequences, which means identifying the obligation and then saying what, so what has to be done as a result of it. And in this case, they're just identifying the obligations. That is the distinction they're drawing between previous advisory opinions and between the, for example, the South Africa case. So they're reaffirming here something that they already said in the opinion on the illegality of the occupation in July 2024, that an occupying power has a general obligation to administer the territory for the benefit of the local population. Because the underlying idea of modern post-World War II international law on military occupations is they're supposed to be inherently temporary, that they should never be allowed to, be used for territorial aggrandizement, and that the occupying power has no rights, really. They just have obligations to the people, and one of them is to make sure that the people in the territory are not adversely affected by being occupied for as long as the occupation lasts. So then they go into what is called the principle of distinction, or sometimes the principle of discrimination in international humanitarian law, i.e. the Geneva Conventions and related instruments, which is the idea that military operations always have to distinguish between civilians and civilian objects and combatants and military objectives. So military obligations obviously can only be directed against combatants. And that, it's worth noting, I don't know if they're going to get into it, is only if there is what's called jus ad bellum, the right to wage war in the first place, which they already found in the previous advisory opinion Israel does not have, because Israel is an occupying power, has no right to self-defense against the population they're occupying. A small group of participants contested Israel's status as an occupying power in relation to the Gaza Strip, which is cute because the court just ruled on this. Like, if you were to do this in a national court, like, go in and, like, go to, like, the U.S. Supreme Court or something like that. They've ruled something. They just ruled one way, and you just get up there and say, "Yeah, actually, Your Honor, your ruling the other day is bullshit. And we're just going to be arguing with you about your previous ruling." You'll get fucking laughed out of court. But the ICJ is unfortunately a paper tiger. So there you go. I mean, they already concluded in the 2024 opinion that Israel is the occupier of the Gaza Strip because they remained capable of exercising and continue to exercise certain key elements of authority over the Gaza Strip, and that Israel's obligations under the law of occupation remain commensurate with the degree of its effective control over the Gaza Strip. I mean, this is something international law experts have been saying for literal decades, ever since 2005, when Israel pretended that they were no longer occupying the Strip, even though they controlled the airspace, the territorial waters, every border crossing, either directly or indirectly through Egypt. I mean, and none of this is a bombshell revelation, is one thing that we have to be clear on. I mean, you could get the idea with the way that governments like the U.S. respond to this stuff, and a lot of people in the media respond to this stuff, that this is like, oh, this is a shock horror thing. How could they possibly have come up with this? If you know anything about what international law says, and you know anything about the state of discussion in circles discussing international humanitarian law and stuff as it applies to Gaza, all of this stuff is a fucking no-brainer. Like, literally, it would have been shocking if they came out any other way. I mean, in fact, it would have... and that's the thing with these international institutions, particularly on the question of Palestine, but also in terms of anything to do with the U.S. doing things directly or indirectly, is they have two ways to completely damage their credibility. One is by just ignoring the law and saying that whatever the U.S. or the U.S.'s proxies are doing is okay. And the other is by upholding the law and saying, yeah, this is obviously illegal, and they damage their credibility then by just reminding everybody that they're a fucking, a paper tiger. And that's... So these cases are kind of a poison chalice for the ICJ, but on the other hand, do kind of point out, for those of us who are trying to struggle against this, just how little help we can actually expect from international law and institutions that try to uphold it. And that's important, because it tells us what we need to be doing. It tells us where we need to expend our efforts. Okay. Since that date, Israel's effective control of the Gaza Strip has increased significantly. Obviously. The relevance... Okay, here's an important one. Okay, the relevance of Israel's security concerns. Because, as they say, some participants place significant emphasis on the security concerns of Israel as justification for its conduct. both in general terms and in relation to some of its specific obligations as an occupying power. And yeah, fuck Israel's security concerns. In its written statement, Israel gave a detailed account of what it described as, quote, the shocking extent of UNRWA's infiltration by Hamas and other terrorist organizations during the horrifying attack on Israel on 7 October 2023 and the subsequent military hostilities, for which they have, never provided any evidence. The court is conscious of Israel's security concerns. Okay, they say, while certain provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is the one that deals with civilians, the protection of civilians during military conflict, and therefore also deals with the subject of occupied territory, the protection of security interests is not a freestanding exception permitting a state to depart from the otherwise applicable rules of international humanitarian law. Any limitations on Israel's obligation under international humanitarian law based on its security concerns must be grounded in a specific rule. The court does not consider, thus, that Israel's security concerns limit the scope of Israel's obligations as an occupying power. The court underscores that the reliance upon such concerns must be exercised in accordance with the principle of good faith, which is, in this context, that's kind of throwing judicial shade. What just happened here? Okay. Further, the court emphasizes that when states take measures to combat terrorism, they must comply with their obligations under international law, including, in particular, obligations with respect to international humanitarian law. Yeah, okay. Obviously, that's just... The question, of course, that's just a given. The question, of course, is what that means in a particular case. Okay, paragraph 92 here. More specific obligations apply in the case of occupation. Articles 55 and 56 obligate an occupying power to ensure that the population of the occupied territory is supplied with the essentials of daily life, including food, water, shelter, medical supplies, and medical care. Literally, when Yoav Gallant announced the starvation siege beginning on the 9th of October 2023, he listed off literally all the things that they are specifically obligated to provide, not just allow the entry of, but provide as an occupying power. Okay, so they're analyzing what they specifically say. As the occupying power, Israel's obligation under the first paragraph of Article 59 to agree to and facilitate relief schemes if the local population is inadequately supplied is unconditional. That is important. And anyone who's going to claim that they're adequately supplied, that they've been adequately supplied at any point during the siege, really any point since 67, is just so full of shit, there's just no point talking to him. Relief schemes may be undertaken either by states or by impartial humanitarian orgs. So... shall consist in particular provision of consignments of foodstuffs, medical supplies, and clothing. In particular means that the obligation is not limited to the categories of items that are explicitly identified, although items must have the character of relief supplies. They may include water, bedding, and shelter. I mean, depending, of course, on specific needs. For example, if the occupying power has like destroyed all your water, bedding, and shelter, then they definitely include those things. Okay, so they point out that the fourth paragraph of Article 59 allows a state granting free passage to aid consignments the right to inspect those consignments and be reasonably satisfied, quote, that those consignments are to be used for the relief of the deprived population. However, no state may exercise these rights to impede the delivery of relief consignments in a manner that undermines the performance of its obligations as set out in Article 59. So, of course, the question here, we haven't gotten to this, because right now they're dealing with the underlying provisions that they have to analyze here, is how they apply that in the case of a power that they've already said is illegally occupying the territory they're occupying. This is also important. An occupying power's obligation to agree to and facilitate the entry of humanitarian relief into an occupied territory under Article 59 does not displace its basic obligations to ensure the availability of food and medical supplies essential to the survival of the local population. See paragraphs 128 to 133 below. The first sentence of Article 60 clarifies that relief consignment shall in no way relieve the occupying power of any of its responsibilities under Articles 55, 56, and 59. Now that's important here because Israel is obligated at its own expense to provide for all these things for the territory, for the population in the territories it's occupied since 67. To provide. They've never done that. At most, they have allowed third countries to provide it at their expense and allowed Palestinians to buy it at their expense. So, and we need to keep this in mind when we talk about these fucking ceasefire deals and all this bullshit, where Israel will agree to, let in a certain amount of trucks or something like that. Like this time it's supposed to be 600 a day. But, I mean, that's bullshit, actually. Because Israel does not, because under international law, they have an obligation to be providing this stuff all along, unconditionally. They don't get to exact any kind of concessions out of the Palestinians for these things. And on top of that, there's an Article 47 in the Fourth Geneva Convention that specifically says that if the occupying power tries to impose an agreement with the occupied population, saying that to get them to waive certain obligations of the occupying power, that's invalid. In fact, that they relied heavily on that back in the July 2024 advisory opinion in their dealing with Oslo, which was exactly a sort of agreement that was supposed to relieve Israel of obligations as an occupying power in exchange for fuck all. And they said that was just invalid, that could not be used to justify what they were doing. Okay, let's see. So, thus, an occupying power must do more than simply allow the passage of essential items into an occupied territory. It must also use all means at its disposal so that these items are distributed in a regular, fair, and non-discriminatory manner, including by facilitating access to them and refraining from threats or use of violence or lethal force against the civilian population seeking to access such humanitarian relief. Again, just the flagrancy. This is not controversial, it's worth noting, as a general matter. The controversy when it comes to international law in Palestine since 67 at least, has never been what international law says. It's whether Palestinians get to rely on it. Whether, Palestinians are even just people with rights under international law. And that is cloaked in all sorts of bullshit. But, the argument has been between people who say, no, they're not, they don't get to, rely on any rights under international law, and people who say, well, obviously, if this stuff doesn't apply to them, it just doesn't exist. So... Okay. Okay, it goes into... This is on the question of whether the Palestinians in Gaza are inadequately supplied. Because the Fourth Geneva Convention imposes specific obligations if there is an issue of inadequate supply. And, yeah. With respect to... Okay, here we go. This should be interesting. They're talking about the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the mercenary outfit run by a Christian Zionist and staffed by Nazi bikers, it turns out, that has been just used as a fucking death trap for starving people. The fact that people will even go to the place... now they've been dismantled, often by the population themselves. The fact that people were even going to these places tells you how fucking desperate they were. Because, 2,000 people were killed by Israel using these fucking aid sites as a lure. With respect to the period since 27 May 2025, when the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation began operating, Israel has insisted that it has facilitated the entry of an unprecedented scale of humanitarian assistance with an influx of aid that far exceeded Gaza's immediate civilian needs. Careraja, weón. Esto, weón, es un careraja. Far exceeded my ass. The court, however, takes note of credible reports on the marked increase of deaths from malnutrition in the months since the court held its oral hearings in these proceedings. Let's see explanations submitted on behalf of the Secretary General of the UN. Yeah. In light of this evidence, the court finds that the local population in the Gaza Strip has been inadequately supplied within the meaning of Article 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. In such a situation, Israel, as the occupying power, is under an obligation to agree to and facilitate relief schemes under that provision. Okay, so, again, with these opinions, the thing that is... There's no surprise in terms of the application of the law, because it is just so basic. It is, there is no serious question about what these things mean. There's no serious question about the facts, either. As much as Israel and the US will try to muddy the waters and come up with all sorts of bullshit. Hola, GGM. There's no serious dispute about the facts. And media outlets that pretend that there's any kind of both sides on any of this are just deliberately lying to people. Or they're incompetent. Either way, they have absolutely no credibility. Israel... Okay, let's check this out. This is what Israel contended. The occupying power has no obligation to consent to or facilitate relief schemes conducted by organizations which are not impartial or whose objectives are not exclusively humanitarian. Well, which is kind of funny, considering that, the one organization, the one so-called relief scheme they have been willing to permit, is explicitly extremely partial, and whose obligations aren't even somewhat humanitarian. According to Israel, quote, "It is indeed critical that the occupying power agreeing to a relief scheme perceives the organization or state in question to be both impartial and humanitarian, trust that they will conduct their operations accordingly. Yeah, see, they need to feel safe. Fuck you. God. Israel does not consider UNRWA to be an impartial organization, has argued that as a result, UNRWA does not come within the purview of Article 59, because they say so. Literally, that's their argument, because we fucking say so. The court observes that the court didn't agree with the because we say so approach, which also it's worth noting, I mean, the biggest precedent for that in recent decades was when the U.S. announced under George W. Bush that they would not be allowing the International Committee of the Red Cross to perform their usual duty in such situations of determining whether the hostages the U.S. was holding and continues to hold in Guantanamo Bay were in fact civilians and thus not or POWs, because the U.S. decided that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to the U.S. And I mean, Bush's position was that the U.S. said so, so therefore they don't fall under the Geneva Conventions. But the whole way the Geneva Conventions are set up post 1949 is so there's no such thing as a person who doesn't fall under their protection. That's the whole idea. It is designed to be seamless. So I mean, okay. The court observes that the qualification of a humanitarian organization as impartial or otherwise must be based on an objective assessment. It cannot depend only on the unilateral claim of the organization in question or on the unilateral perception of the occupying power, fucking obviously. Oh, interesting. They're citing the time that the U.S. was condemned by the ICJ for international terrorism against Nicaragua in 1986. And the court notes that based on the case file, there is no evidence that UNRWA as an entity breached the principle of impartiality within the meaning of Article 59. In other words, there is no evidence that UNRWA has discriminated with respect to nationality, race, religious belief, class, or political opinion during its distribution of humanitarian aid and provision of services in the OPT. Indeed, there's been no suggestion that UNRWA has engaged in adverse distinction in its distribution of humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip or elsewhere. Moreover, the Colonna report, see paragraph 60 above, did not make any findings to call UNRWA's impartiality into question. See, the issue here, I mean, Israel's claiming that they're not impartial. And the ICRC defines impartial in a very specific way, which is to say that the group does not discriminate as to nationality, race, religious belief, class, or political opinion, endeavors to relieve the suffering of individuals being guided solely by their needs and to give priority to the most urgent cases of distress. Israel doesn't, I mean, we can tarry on the absurdity of Israel claiming to object to discrimination between Palestinians on their behalf. But we know they were never accusing that. When they say impartial, they're saying that they think humanitarian organizations are siding with an occupied population over their killers, which they're allowed to do. If a humanitarian organization managed to make it into the Warsaw Ghetto, was trying to get into the Warsaw Ghetto, under the 1949 Geneva Conventions, if they applied, Germany would not be able to say, well, these people have an anti-genocide bias. They're in favor of Jews being left alive. So that makes them lack objectivity. And that's not what it's about. That's bullshit. In fact, here they go. Some participants have linked the humanitarian requirement of impartiality with a requirement of neutrality, suggesting that humanitarian orgs may be under an obligation to meet both conditions. The court observes that the two concepts are distinct. While impartiality entails a requirement of non-discrimination in the allocation of aid, neutrality prohibits taking sides in the conflict. Notably, the text of the second paragraph of Article 59 refers to impartiality and not to neutrality. Okay, Israel made all sorts of allegations about UNRWA being Hamas. They dismissed that. The court considers that the information report is not sufficient to establish UNRWA's lack of neutrality for the purpose of assessing its impartiality as an organization under Article 59. The UN took the allegations seriously, responded immediately. They found no evidence. Here we go. The Colonna report is the report into whether there was any truth to these allegations made by Israel. And they concluded here, quote, that UNRWA has established a significant number of mechanisms and procedures to ensure compliance with humanitarian principles, with emphasis on the principle of neutrality, and that it possesses a more developed approach to neutrality than other similar UN or NGO entities. Yeah. Okay, so I'm sure this is a quote that we will probably be seeing taken out of context. In paragraph 120 here, accordingly, an occupying power is in principle free to choose the humanitarian organizations through which it fulfills its obligation to agree to and facilitate humanitarian relief. However, it goes on, Article 59 limits an occupying power's discretion insofar as it requires the power to allow and facilitate sufficient relief to ensure that the population is adequately supplied. Therefore, the court must consider how this general rule applies in the particular context of UNRWA's involvement in the Gaza Strip and assess Israel's actions to replace UNRWA with other humanitarian organizations. Okay, first of all, they say that in the current circumstances, obviously, it is not possible to replicate the capacity of the UN acting through UNRWA to ensure that the population of the Gaza Strip is adequately provided for. I mean, obviously. And all these attempts to pretend otherwise, that you could just kind of ban UNRWA and put private organizations in there, it's nonsense. There's literally no replacement for the level of service that UNRWA provides. Certainly not on short notice, as they say, and without a proper transition plan. Unless, of course, Eddie Murphy meme, you don't give a fuck whether Palestinians live or die, or you're kind of okay if they do die. Then you can do it really easily. Okay. So they observe that Israel has itself not ensured that the population of the Gaza Strip is adequately supplied. Yeah, I mean, obviously. Fucking obviously. The evidence thus shows that whether or not the operations of the UN acting through UNRWA were replaceable, Israel had no replacement system mobilized for a 10-week period. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a purported replacement for UNRWA, has been widely criticized by the UN and other international actors, and its operations have been alleged to be inconsistent with core humanitarian principles. Okay, it was inadequate. The court concludes that, under these circumstances, the UN acting through UNRWA has been an indispensable provider of humanitarian relief in the Gaza Strip. There is no current realistic alternative to UNRWA that could adequately provide the services and assistance required by Palestine refugees. So, okay, and here's their conclusion. This is the important part. Having regard to Article 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and in the circumstances, the court considers that Israel is under an obligation to agree to and facilitate relief schemes provided by the UN and its entities, including UNRWA. So, in other words, it is illegal for Israel to just deny access to UNRWA. Again, if you have like any familiarity at all with international law, this does not come as a surprise. It doesn't even really come as a surprise that the ICJ would rule this way, because they have a history now at this point of getting these things right, more or less. Like going back to the Wall opinion in like 2005, when they first said that an occupying power does not have a right of self-defense against an occupied population. And, you know, their previous advisory opinion last year and stuff. I mean, none of this stuff is a shock. Okay. Now they're talking about states and other impartial humanitarian organizations. As long as the population remains inadequately supplied and Israel is not itself operating a system of humanitarian support that is in accordance with its obligations under international humanitarian law, and of course Israel has just openly said they refuse, they're not going to, they never have. Israel is obliged under Article 59 to agree to and facilitate relief schemes provided by third states or impartial humanitarian orgs such as the ICRC. So, okay, obligation to ensure the basic needs of the population. Must be read in conjunction with Article 59 in considering Israel's obligations in relation to the activities of the UN, other international orgs, and third states. The occupying power, quote, has the duty of ensuring that the food and medical supplies of the population. It should, in particular, bring in the necessary foodstuffs, medical stores, and other articles if the resources of the occupied territory are inadequate. Okay, the additional protocol adds clothing, bedding, means of shelter, other supplies essential to the survival of the civilian population of the occupied territory, and objects necessary for religious worship. And the thing to note about this is important. This is independent of any kind of deal that Palestinians sign on to. Like, the resistance signed on to this deal because they are committed to, like, ending the aggression against their people, and they see this as potentially a chance to do that, or at least to get them some level of respite. Israel's obligations are not contingent on that deal. They're not contingent on any of this. The Palestinians and the resistance don't have to agree to shit. These are the unconditional obligations that Israel has taken on as an occupying power. If they don't want to fulfill those obligations, they need to stop being an occupying power and get the fuck out. That's how this works. That is very important here. Okay. And then the occupying power has the duty of ensuring and maintaining, with the cooperation of national and local authorities, the medical and hospital establishments and services, public health and hygiene in the occupied territory, with particular reference to the adoption and application of the prophylactic and preventive measures necessary to combat the spread of contagious diseases and epidemics. Medical personnel of all categories shall be allowed to carry out their duties. I mean, what can you even fucking say about this? I mean, Israel's holding a number of doctors hostage, including the interim director of Kamil Adwan Hospital, Hussam Abu Safiya. I mean, they've systematically destroyed all this shit. The entire medical infrastructure. I mean, the reason the official figures on how many people have been murdered by the U.S. and Israel and Gaza are so low is precisely because Israel and the U.S. have systematically destroyed the infrastructure for determining those things. Okay, they note that this is not contingent on inadequate supply, and therefore also extends beyond the Gaza Strip to other parts of the OPT. Under these provisions, okay, here's their conclusion. They hold that Under these provisions, Israel is not only required to perform the positive obligation to ensure essential supplies to the local population to the fullest extent of the means available to it, but is also under a negative obligation not to impede the provision of these supplies or the performance of services related to public health. In this respect, to the extent that Israel does not itself fulfill the obligations under Articles 55 and 56, leaving that responsibility to the UN acting through UNRWA, as well as other international orgs in third states, Israel is under the same positive and negative obligations to support and not restrict the activities of those entities. Okay, so they say Israel's obligations under these provisions dealing with humanitarian support of the occupied population require Israel either to facilitate the operations of UNRWA or to otherwise ensure that the obligations are fully met. Now, they're not dealing with legal consequences, they're just dealing with obligations, so they don't go on to say, obviously, Israel is in total breach of these fucking obligations. The court notes that according to the UN, between 7 October 2023 and 20 August 2025, at least 531 humanitarian workers, including 366 UN personnel, were killed in the Gaza Strip, 360 of whom were working for UNRWA. Israel alleges that some of the UNRWA employees killed have been identified by Israel as members of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Which, it's interesting that they never accuse them of being members of the PFLP or the DFLP or the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, who are all working together in the Joint Resistance Operations Table. It's always Hamas or Saraya. Okay. Article 71, paragraph 3 clarifies that activities of the relief personnel may be limited and their movements may be temporarily restricted only in case of imperative military necessity. Also protected by the principle of distinction. So I mean, like, even saying this after these past 2 years, the court considers that Israel is thus required to respect and protect relief and medical personnel and facilities. No shit. Consistent with the principle of distinction, Israel must carefully distinguish between civilians and combatants and civilian objects and military objectives, noting that civilians only lose their protected status if they take direct part in hostilities, and only for the time that they are so engaged in hostilities. Now, they're not getting into the legal consequences here. They made that distinction very clearly. So all they're saying is this is the obligation. Now, I can see some bad faith readings will try to act like they're not saying that Israel was in breach and therefore Israel is actually not breaching the law. I can totally see that sort of bad faith reading because I've seen all the other bad faith readings of the other opinions that the ICJ has issued in the past couple of years. But the point is, they're not saying that because, as they very specifically said, this isn't about the legal consequences of the obligations. Since they're not actually... Since all they've been asked is the obligations and not the legal consequences, they don't have to investigate the extent to which those obligations are being fulfilled. So they don't. So then, because they don't investigate that here, because there are other cases pending where they are investigating that, they are not stating a conclusion. That is literally the only reason that they are not stating a conclusion here, Destiny. I can totally see him doing this because I saw him do that with the fucking South Africa provisional measures decision. Where he was like, oh, well, they said it's not even well-founded. Just not even acknowledging that actually what they were doing That is a completely separate stage of the proceedings where you determine whether it's well founded, and they weren't at it yet, so they weren't taking a position on that because they didn't have to. Prohibition of forcible transfer and deportation. Now, this is important because, as part of this ceasefire agreement that Israel has flagrantly breached, they have been exiling Palestinian hostages that they released. And that's illegal under the first paragraph of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, as they're about to say. Provides that individual or mass forcible transfers and deportations from occupied territory of protected persons within the meaning of that convention are prohibited regardless of their motive. So, like, that they're just exiling released hostages like that is prohibited. Deportation or forcible transfer of the civilian population of an occupied territory, in whole or in part, is also prohibited under customary international law. Obviously. Okay, while the second paragraph of Article 49 allows an occupying power to evacuate people to a given area, quote, if the security of the population or imperative military reasons so demand, it provides that persons thus evacuated shall be transferred back to their homes as soon as hostilities in the area in question have ceased. And, I mean, the security, if the only reason the security of the population is at risk is that you're going to kill the people who remain there, that doesn't fucking count, actually. I'm pretty sure we're going to hear something to that effect. According to some participants, including the United Nations, the Israeli military has issued numerous displacement orders forcing hundreds of thousands of people into overcrowded areas and restricting the United Nations' ability to deliver urgently needed essential supplies. The court observes that Israel as an occupying power is prohibited from restricting the presence and activities of the United Nations, other international orgs, and third states, and in relation to the occupied Palestinian territory to a degree that creates or contributes to the conditions of life that would force the population to leave. I mean, that's actually pretty close to a legal conclusion there. Prohibition of starvation as a method of... Okay, the right of protected persons in detention to be visited by the ICRC. According to two participants, Israel has denied the ICRC access to Palestinian detainees since 7 October 2023. And here's the thing that should be kept in mind. Because in their advisory opinion in July 2024, they also dealt with the question of Israel extending its domestic jurisdiction to the West Bank. And pointed out that that's illegal. What that means is they can't be just... They don't get to try and convict Palestinians from the 1967 territories for anything because they don't have jurisdiction. Which means that these people are being illegally held no matter what Israel's pretext is. Article 143 internalize the ICRC to go to all places where protected persons are, particularly places of internment, detention, and work, as well as access to all premises occupied by protected persons. Further stipulates that these visits may be prohibited only for reasons of imperative military necessity, and then only as an exceptional and temporary measure, and that the duration and frequency shall not be restricted. Okay. Starvation is as... Okay. The court further refers to its finding in paragraphs 102 to 109 above that the local population of the Gaza Strip has been inadequately supplied. In these circumstances, the court recalls Israel's obligation not to use starvation of the civilian population as a method of warfare. And, okay. Okay, so now they're getting into international human rights law. Okay, the court already confirmed in 2024 that Israel is bound by the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in respect of its conduct with regard to the OPT. In the court's view, the principle that a state's human rights obligations extend to acts taken by the state in exercise of its jurisdiction outside of its own territory, particularly in occupied territories, also applies with respect to the Convention on Ending Discrimination Against Women, the Convention Against Torture, and what was CRPD? Persons with disabilities. Okay. The court has confirmed that Israel has a positive obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill international human rights in the OPT, even in times of armed conflict. The court observes that to the extent that the local population has been capable of enjoying many of these human rights in the OPT, this has been largely enabled and ensured through the work of the United Nations, particularly through UNRWA, supported by the activities of other international orgs in third states. Consequently, any diminution by Israel of the capacity of UNRWA and these other actors to ensure these basic human rights means that the obligations of Israel to respect, protect, and fulfill these rights increases to a commensurate degree. Okay. This is talking about the right to life. The duty to protect the right to life also requires states to take measures addressing widespread hunger and malnutrition, as well as extreme poverty and homelessness. Further, where necessary, states must ensure that individuals have access without delay to essential goods and services. I mean, yeah, we can see how that applies. I think here, non-discrimination in women's access to healthcare services. Okay, facilitate the proper working of all institutions devoted to the care and education of children. Well, we've seen what they've done there. When you get down to it, this is yet another opinion that specifically says that literally everything that Israel just openly and explicitly does is a crime. Except they don't go so far as saying it's a crime because that's a legal consequence, and they're just saying what the obligations are. Like, you can just go through this and point out Israel and the U.S. just flagrantly ignoring these obligations because nobody's making them do otherwise. Okay, now, obligations as a member of the United Nations. Interesting. Permanent responsibility of the United Nations toward the question of Palestine. Okay, so... obligation to cooperate with the United Nations. Compliance with this duty to render assistance is important for the effective functioning of the organization. This is important. The court recalls that Israel as an occupying power is not entitled to sovereignty over or to exercise sovereign powers in any part of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. By enacting and enforcing the two laws adopted by the Knesset on 28 October 2024 that unilaterally terminated Israel's cooperation with UNRWA, including its operation in East Jerusalem, Israel continues to exercise sovereign power in East Jerusalem. Moreover, these laws have directly resulted in obstructions to the operations of UNRWA in and in relation to the occupied Palestinian territory, in particular the Gaza Strip. Israel is not entitled to withhold its cooperation with the UN by unilaterally deciding on the presence and activities of UN entities in and in relation to the OPT, subject to paragraph 184 below. Now I'm kind of curious what that says. Okay, privileges and immunities. Okay, the court recall. This is to do with headquarters. It follows that within the territory of Israel, the presence and activities of the UN and its entities are subject to the consent of Israel. However, in the occupied territory over which Israel as an occupying power enjoys no sovereignty, it is not entitled to decide unilaterally with respect to the presence of and activities of the UN and in relation to the OPT in the same way as on its own territory. Okay. Privileges and immunities of UN staff, premises, property, and assets. Yeah. Under this provision, Israel's obligation is twofold. First, with regard to the premises of the UN, including its field offices in the OPT, Israel must respect their inviolability and not interfere with the performance of their functions. The court considers that the question whether a particular facility in the OPT qualifies as the premises of the United Nations must be assessed by taking into account the specific circumstances pertaining to each facility concerned. Okay, no administrative or judicial or legislative actions against the property and assets of the UN and its entities in the OPT, such as search, requisition, confiscation, expropriation, or any other form of interference, are explicitly prohibited by Article 2, Section 3 of the General Convention. Okay. Exempt from customs duties, prohibitions, restriction on imports and exports. Under this provision, Israel must grant the United Nations its assets, income, and other property exemption from customs duties and prohibitions and restrictions on the import and export in respective articles for its official use. Okay, privileges and immunities of personnel. Basically, okay, we're talking about UN experts. And so this is saying essentially, and again, this is one of these very just basic things that they're pointing out, namely that Israel is not exempt from the general rule that UN experts on a mission are have immunity. They can't just be searched and other shit. And their free movement has to be allowed. They have an affirmative obligation to ensure the safety and security of UN personnel. That includes ensuring that UN personnel are not targeted, obviously. And they have an obligation to use the legal framework to address any concerns around privileges and immunities rather than just unilaterally banning UN organizations like UNRWA. Okay. The court calls that Israel's territorial claim over East Jerusalem has long been declared null and void by Security Council Resolution 478 of 1980. Respect for the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people requires Israel not to prevent the fulfillment of the basic needs of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, including by the UN, its entities, or other international orgs and third states. Lastly, UNRWA's unique mandate relates to the core aspects of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Missions undertaken by UNRWA in the areas of direct relief, humanitarian development assistance, through its programs covering education and training, healthcare, direct relief, and developmental services, are a manifestation of the organization's commitment to its responsibility with respect to the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Moreover, as noted above, since October 2023, UNRWA has remained the principal means and the backbone of all humanitarian response in the Gaza Strip. In this connection, Israel is under an obligation not to impede the operations of UN entities, other international orgs, third states, and to cooperate in good faith. An international obligation to do basically the opposite. The absolute direct opposite of what Israel is doing. Okay, here we go, the conclusions, and then I'm going to wrap this up. To ensure, unanimously they find Israel has an obligation to ensure the population of the occupied Palestinian territory has essential supplies of daily life, including food, water, clothing, bedding, shelter, fuel, medical supplies, and services. By 10 to 1, we guess that's probably Sebutinde, the dissenting vote, because she is a fanatical Christian Zionist who plagiarizes PragerU in her shitty dissenting opinions, which don't even pretend to be legal opinions. They're just nonsense. Here we go, against Vice President Sebutinde. To agree that Israel has an obligation to agree and facilitate by all means at its disposal, release schemes on behalf of the population of the OPT, so long as the population is inadequately supplied, as has been the case in the Gaza Strip, including relief provided by the UN and its entities, and particularly UNRWA and other international orgs and third states, and not to impede such relief. And of course, fucking Sebutinde votes against that. I mean, part of me has morbid curiosity about why. Unanimously, to respect and protect all relief and medical personnel and facilities. Unanimously, to respect the prohibition on forcible transfer and deportation of the occupied Palestinian territory. Even Sebutinde would not vote against that. To respect the right of protected persons from the OPT who are detained by the State of Israel to be visited by the ICRC. Unanimously, even Sebutinde is not going to vote against this, it seems. To respect the prohibition on the use of starvation for civilians as a method of warfare. An obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of the population of the OPT, including through presence and activities of the UN, other international orgs and third states, and in relation to the occupied Palestinian territory. All by 10 votes to 1, and against it's Sebutinde. She's like literally voting against the idea of human rights. Okay, 10 to 1, again, an obligation to cooperate in good faith with the UN by providing every assistance in the action it takes in accordance with the Charter of the UN, including UNRWA, and in relation to the OPT. And again, it's Sebutinde voting against. She's literally here voting against the idea that Israel has the obligation to follow the basic treaties on the UN. Like, seriously, what a fucking disgrace that she's on the court. Oh, here we go again. Sebutinde, say the line. Is of the opinion that Israel has an obligation under Article 105 of the UN Charter to assure full respect for the privileges and immunities according to the UN, including its agencies and bodies and its officials and in relation to the OPT. And fucking Sebutinde, of course, says no. UN facilities are fair game there. Okay, 10 to 1. Of the opinion that Israel has an obligation, Article 2 of the Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the UN, to ensure full respect for the inviolability of the premises of the United Nations, including those of UNRWA, for the immunity, the property, and assets of the organization from any form of interference, which is, again, this is the most basic shit. This is, like, taken for granted basically everywhere. And Sebutinde is saying no. No, Israel doesn't have to follow that particular requirement. Full respect for privileges and immunities of the UN, including as accorded to officials and experts on mission of the United Nations, in relation to the OPT. I mean, again, this is just basic fucking thing. This is not like some special provision or anything. This is totally uncontroversial that the UN has this kind of immunity. It's analogous to diplomatic immunity, and of course Sebutinde says, no, I disagree. I mean, like, I am morbidly curious what her bullshit PragerU-pilled response to this is going to be. I might even stream reading it, because we know it's going to be some bullshit, and we know that those talking points will show up someplace, because she probably got them off PragerU, because she's been caught plagiarizing them in the past. Okay, and with that wraps up this little special stream on the advisory opinion of the ICJ in relation to whether Israel is required not to starve people to death in Gaza. Thank you to everyone who watched. I hope you enjoyed the stream, and I will be back at 11:30 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time on Friday, 2 days from now, with the usual Last JabroniCon. Have a good evening,